Oh boy, Dead Space 3. To give some background on my time with the franchise, I played Dead Space 2 first, then Dead Space 1, which I played even more for some reason. Then around 2014, I got Dead Space 3 as part of a PlayStation Plus game, and I played like little more than half, then never touched it again. I think I played through about halfway again a few years back. It's not that it's unmemorable, in fact, I remember quite a lot about it, it's just not as good as the rest of the series. Dead Space 3 is the ultimate game development cautionary tale. After Dead Space 2, a tight, robust, and replayable single-player game failed to live up to EA's expectations, Dead Space 3 needed to be bigger, badder, and just bigger. It's not better. The first thing people will tell you about Dead Space 3 is that it shouldn't have added co-op. I will get to that in a second. The second thing is that it's too action-focused, which is a weird criticism, but a valid one. Within the first opening hour, you're treated to a host of over-the-top set pieces and cover shooting sections against human enemies. It's all lushly detailed and sumptuously presented. The polish that defined previous games is still here, but this is very much not the same Dead Space fans came to know and love. And that feels purposeful. There are so many new aspects to the game, so many elements modified, added, or removed to make it feel more like a reinvention rather than the iteration the series saw from Dead Space 1 to 2. Before I get into the changes, let's look at the setup. Years after Dead Space 2, Isaac is depressed. His girlfriend, Ellie, has left him, and then he gets a knock at the door where two ding-dongs say she's missing and he needs to help destroy another marker. Then all hell breaks loose as a unitologist cult leader, Hugh Grant, tries to trigger an apocalypse. I knew Paddington should have wasted him when he had the chance. Here's the thing, I did a whole video on Dead Space Expanded lore. I watched multiple movies, comic books, games, and novels, and this setup still feels out of left field. As you race against time to find Ellie and destroy the marker, Isaac and company stumble upon the planet of Tau Volantis, the marker homeworld. But this isn't just a simple mission to the heart of the beast, oh no, that would be too easy. Also, can I say Tau Volantis more, please? Tau Volantis, Tau Volantis, Tau Volantis. See, Dead Space 3 released in 2013, when the whole industry was trying to make games more cinematic, and that meant trying to make players cry through emotional manipulation. Yet, it was before Last of Us came out and showed everyone that all you really need to do is manipulate people with mediocre writing and sad dads. So there's a lot of unnecessary plot stuff in Dead Space 3. When you find Ellie, you're immediately thrust into a love triangle of jealousy with her new main squeeze, Captain Mayonnaise Whitebread, and yeah, that's kind of Ellie's role for the runtime, which sucks. In Dead Space 2, Ellie was an independent, capable, witty survivor. In Dead Space 3, Ellie is literally a prize in a tight-fitting tank top for Isaac to fight over. Like, he literally has conversations where he says he and the other guy just need to fight over her. And that's not even the worst of how she is used, but that's not all. Game is also dead set on telling you at every turn how much Isaac and Carver have sacrificed, what makes a good man, and other macho nonsense that just kind of shit on all the other people who were also good people who got sacrificed. Like, how about that lady Carver kills? Was she a good person? Who cares, I guess. Look at these sad polygons. David Cage would be proud. The story does give a good setup for a change of scenery. After the cyberpunk city escape, and some classic spacewalking abandoned ships, the icy surface Tau Volantis injects some much-needed variety into the series' locales. It's fitting for a game so inspired by John Carpenter's The Thing to end up on a frozen ice ball where a group struggles to survive. Dead Space 3, despite being more action-oriented, managed to be very atmospheric throughout. As you peruse the abandoned corridors of ships or the rotting carcass of a research outpost, the grimy, grungy brown and red textures mix with the fog and flickering lights to create some amazing visuals. Outside, you're often treated to a blend of pastel oranges, reds, purples, and blues, with strange lights of an outer space horizon coating everything and making for a nice change of pace from the rest of the era's color schemes. It's not fully escaped from the console era's reliance on muted tones, but is still saturated enough to have moments of stunning artistry that will make you stop and gawk at the odd sci-fi hallway or tundra horizon. It's a shame that, for all its artistic achievements, Dead Space 3 never manages to be very scary. Which brings me to gameplay. Much of Dead Space 3 is overhauled from the previous entries. One of the biggest changes is to weapons. Instead of buying weapons at a kiosk, Isaac now has to scavenge parts and create them on his own. It's honestly a really neat system, and I found myself swapping parts at every bench for the first few hours. It allows for some truly unique weapon designs that would make Borderlands blush. I wasn't sold immediately, but when I made an acid Gatling gun with an underbarrel rocket launcher, or a plasma cutter that was also an electric flamethrower, I was sold. The problem is how this system interacts with the rest of the game. Enemies, like weapons, have been overhauled. There are a few mainstays like the acid spitters and the little babies that have back tendrils, but the new necromorphs you encounter on the frozen planet of Tau Volantis are not very interesting. The standard enemies will mutate and change form when bisected, which is a really interesting idea the first few times it happens, but it doesn't happen with the other enemies, making it feel like a missed opportunity for some new enemy designs that could really shake things up. But Dead Space 3, for all its changes, isn't interested in shaking things up. Instead, the carefully curated encounter designs of previous games that used a variety of unique enemies that required different weapons, Dead Space 3, needing to accommodate whatever contraptions you MacGyver together, just spits a bunch of enemies at you. The necessity of dismemberment is almost entirely done away with. There's only one ammo type, and the game gives you copious amounts of health packs to deal with the onslaught of damage from the enemy mobs. So no longer is Dead Space a horror survival game, it's just a horror shooter. You also fight regular humans, which is just as exciting as it sounds. Another thing about Dead Space 3 is that it came out in the dawning years of what I call maximalist game design, where everything had to be more. Not better, just bigger. The other game I think really rings true here is Resident Evil 6, which I will get to someday maybe. Dead Space 3 features larger areas, side missions, plenty of collectibles, 4 additional difficulty modes, so if you want all the achievements, you're looking at like 5 to 6 playthroughs, and of course co-op. See, here's the thing. Co-op was big for some reason at the time. Gears had it, Halo had it, Resident Evil had it, and now Dead Space had it. But you can actually feel the corporate mandate behind it in the game because Visceral did everything they could to make the Dead Space 3 solo experience feel like just a single-player game. Your co-op partner, the great value brand Marcus Phoenix, will join you on your journey in a co-op game, but otherwise, Carver is just another survivor that follows you around. It's honestly a good approach. He's not like Dom in Gears, where he's always there, so it just feels like a Dead Space adventure with Isaac. The problem is, there are specific story beats and side missions you can't engage with unless you're playing co-op. On paper, it's a neat way to encourage co-op play, but what about people playing the game a decade later, EA? Or people who don't have any friends? Now, you might hear all of this and go, blah, that's not my Dead Space, and think that Dead Space 3 ruined the franchise. Well, it certainly isn't anywhere near the lofty heights of Dead Space 2, but few games are. It's overlong, bloated, like twice as long as 2, has problems with pacing, and I haven't even mentioned the copious amounts of random side segments like wall climbing, flying, turret sections, and more. But here's the thing. A decade after the disappointment wears off, Dead Space 3 is a pretty good shooter, actually. The core combat is still slick and refined, the addition of a dodge mechanic is welcome. The weapon system allows for some fun choices, and the gunplay is still satisfyingly violent. There's a lot of variety, the overall story can be compelling at times, and the whole thing still looks very shiny and pretty. Is it a good Dead Space game? Probably not. Is it a good way to end Isaac's trilogy and story? Honestly, debatable. Is it a solid shooter with great presentation and replayability? Yes. Dead Space 3 isn't a classic, but it's far from an apocalyptic mess, and it's certainly not bad enough to have ground this series to a halt for 10 years. I mean, EA, what the hell? Anyway, play it or don't, but if you keep your expectations in check, there's a good, occasionally spooky time to be had. Singularity is a game that in my mind always blended together with Time Shift. Both featured faceless protagonists on the cover with dark art, and both were FPS games with a time manipulation gimmick. So I kind of internalized Singularity as yet another COD clone, and boy was I wrong. Well, kinda. Created by Raven Software, Singularity opens like an omen for the future that Raven would spend eternity afterwards slaving away in the Call of Duty mines for Activision. You get Cold War graphics and an intro straight from Black Ops, opening into a helicopter ride with Glenn Morshower over the radio and Nolan North with green text over him sitting across from you like an Unreal Engine Modern Warfare. And then the game proceeds to have an extended 30-minute introduction sequence with minimal, tense combat and horrifying atmosphere. As I explored the dilapidated Soviet architecture, playing audio logs, viewing cheesy propaganda videos, and being treated to some delectably detailed environmental imagery, it dawned on me. Singularity isn't just a Call of Duty clone, it's the love child of Call of Duty and BioShock. Unlike most other military shooters at the time, Singularity takes its time building its atmosphere, world, and story. It takes a silent protagonist approach, letting players explore a fairly linear environment with a host of optional pathways and side rooms that allude to a slightly larger world than is actually being rendered. You soon find you're outnumbered and outgunned in this bizarre Soviet time bubble, fighting strange mutants and time Russians. Of course, coming from a venerated FPS developer like Raven, the house that birthed Hexen and Soldier of Fortune, among plenty of other games, it should be no surprise that shooting ultimately takes center stage for a majority of Singularity's gameplay. And Raven helped Singularity stand out with a combination of satisfying gunplay and unique weapons. The opening hours see you alternating between a solid shotgun, assault rifle, and pistol, but soon enough the possibilities open up and Singularity's weapon selection sings. You've got superheated nail guns, miniguns, a slow-motion sniper rifle, and a grenade launcher with a remote-controlled projectile that you can maneuver to hiding enemies. Then there's the Seeker, one of my favorite guns in recent memory. Other games like Jericho have featured controllable bullets, which are always satisfying. Seriously, if you make a shooter with controllable bullets, it's goated instantly. But then the Seeker also explodes. And when something explodes in Singularity, there aren't even enough pieces left to pick up. Singularity is gory as hell, with even assault rifles and automatic weapons able to sever limbs and explode heads in fashions usually reserved for shotguns. The result is that each slow-mo kill becomes another note in a beautiful ballet of bloody carnage. And speaking of beautiful, Singularity is a gorgeous game. I've mentioned before that Unreal Engine 3 ruled this era, and Singularity is another game bearing the telltale signs of Epic's landmark engine. You've got the green-brown hues, the warm pink-oranges that accompany fire effects, and plenty of texture pop in between it all. But the detail packed into each and every texture, combined with the plethora of ambient particle effects like leaves blowing in the wind, dripping water and rain, set the artistic achievement of Singularity high above contemporaries. Compare this to another Unreal shooter like Turning Point Fall of Liberty, and it's night and day what the teams managed to accomplish on the same engine and hardware. It's even more impressive for how large a scope Singularity can play with, sometimes shifting an entire level's time period mid-gameplay, changing all the assets and skyboxes seamlessly. Even without these moments of technical prowess, Singularity's collection of massive skyboxes, skybeams, and cool-hued vistas are worth a look on their own. Being a game about time travel, and obviously influenced by Bioshock, nobody should be surprised that Singularity gives you various time manipulation powers, courtesy of the hand-mounted TMD. While this might appear to be another magic hand gameplay approach that was ever so popular in this era, evidenced by other games I played here like Legendary, Singularity uses the TMD for a variety of puzzle-solving and gameplay applications that make it more than just a back-of-the-box gameplay gimmick. While never presenting quantum brain teasers on the level of something like Portal, Singularity's use of the TMD to change the state of objects in your environment between the past and present is always fun to play around with, allowing for plenty of clever hidden secrets and a satisfying sense of accomplishment for every environmental puzzle surmounted. Naturally, the TMD also has a variety of combat applications, and here's where the Bioshock comparisons really kick in. Like Bioshock, your health and, mana? Time juice? Your health and your chronal fluids are limited assets that need to be recharged. You can get upgrades throughout that will help with this light RPG system, allowing you to take on a wider variety of enemies in more creative ways. And creativity is where the combat here thrives. You can psionically throw objects, grab shields from enemies, blast close-range fighters back, spit out bubbles of slow motion to get a breather, or just pump entire clips into an enemy in a second when the bubble collapses, or, my personal favorite, turn back time on single enemies, killing them instantly as they collapse into dust. On their own, these powers, with a variety of environmental hazards like explosives, electric, and freezing objects, would set the groundwork for a dense amount of gameplay variety. But in conjunction with an impressive array of weapons, Singularity's combat is head and shoulders above most of the games I've looked at for this series. The game smartly leverages a variety of enemies too, ranging from time-displacing radiation goblins, strange temporal insects, and regular ground, rocket, and sniper troops that you're always forced to take a different approach to combat. But with the implements available, it still feels like it's always on your own terms. However, Singularity isn't a perfect game. While the story and world are initially intriguing, the plain ally characters can't make up for a lack of personality from the protagonist. These people got nothing doing. The closest thing to interesting these characters get is their goofy accents. The story in particular, while having a wonderful opening and setup, just meanders and goes nowhere interesting. The blank slate protagonist really hurts here, as it feels like another leftover of Bioshock's influence, but without Bioshock's supporting cast like Andrew Ryan and Atlas, and without the big "would you kindly" moment to tie it all together, your plain protagonist is left with less flavor than a watered-down bowl of communion wafers. The game does a mercifully good job of checkpointing and load times are reasonable, but some sections leave you underprepared for the enemies the game sets you up against. In particular, the explosive bugs that swarm you from every angle are a constant frustration whenever I came across them. I played on hard my first time through, so maybe that's on me for going in unprepared, but every time these little The game has a number of impressive set pieces and boss fights, some of which are unfortunately undermined by the excessive screen shaking and poor telegraphing of what you're supposed to be doing. This is, to nobody's surprise, exacerbated on higher difficulties, where you can just die in a fight with a very little idea what happened, like, cool monster, but why am I dead? Again. So, Singularity isn't perfect, has a lot of problems, but while it lasts, and when it really works, it's a hell of a time, and I'd say unique enough to count as an underrated gem for the era. Raven pulled off a seriously impressive technical feat with the art design and world building, utilizing the full power of the Unreal Engine with almost none of the common drawbacks. And then they packed in a unique world, kick-ass combat, and fun light RPG system that give plenty of reason to go back for more playthroughs. Doesn't always stick to landing when it comes to story and some of the game's more ambitious moments, but if you want a cool, overlooked FPS game from the era, Singularity is for you. A few episodes back, I mentioned in my review on Dead Space 2 that sequels are often the perfect time for video games to stand out, to improve on everything that made the original work so well. In many cases, that's true, but sometimes sequels excel so far beyond the original game it makes said game look like an alpha build, a testbed for ideas that never properly congealed. Such is the case with Transformers Fall of Cybertron. The sequel to High Moon's well-regarded War for Cybertron isn't just another run-and-gun shooter with minor improvements and new weapons, it's practically a different game. Oh, don't get me wrong, the satisfying gunplay, weighted combat, and solid feedback are all still present, making for an instantly fun experience to pick up and play. The movement, whether in robot or vehicle mode, feels tight, maybe slightly tuned up from the last game, but overall, it still just feels nice. A few additions here and there aid with this, from the camera, which is drawn further back to give a wider view of the battlefield, and the implementation of a hand-switching button, which allows you to freestyle cover by changing which hand your current robot is firing with. It's a lot more useful than it might sound, especially on harder difficulties. Aside from the core gameplay of running, gunning, and transforming, the template of Fall of Cybertron varies greatly from its predecessor. Instead of Gears of War-style co-op shooter, where each level can be completed with buddies, the campaign of Fall is single-player only. In doing this, the team does away with the thin character variety that offered slight variances in playability, depending on which vehicle mode or special ability to which character was selected. In its place is an approach to gameplay variety that goes for the jugular and doesn't let up for the entire runtime. The story is suitably grim, depicting the Autobots' last-ditch efforts to escape the doom world of Cybertron in their Ark spaceship. From the offset, the camera movements and set pieces are much more dramatic, bringing players close into the action and taking a few notes from what Naughty Dog and Call of Duty were doing at the time. From there, we jump straight to the main man Optimus Prime, and these opening levels go hard. You may notice, if you've seen my previous review for War for Cybertron, two major differences to the play spaces of Fall. The choice to pull the camera out further is a great concession for the massively upscaled battlefields in Fall. Where War had larger scale battles, much of the game was confined to glorified hallways. Here, you get plenty of open air, and it only serves to aid the impressive scale of battles like the beginning missions, where Optimus Prime controls the massive robot Metroplex to defend the Ark. Even 2 generations of console hardware later, the scale and fidelity managed by these moments can be jaw-dropping. The other big change to the game's look is the color palette. Where War was a constant morass of gray with slight accents, Fall is bursting with color by comparison. This is still a gritty reboot of children's media and still in the Unreal Engine, so the tones are more muted than the day-glow look of something like Transformers Devastation, but it's nonetheless a much prettier game to look at overall. Once you get past the impressive first impressions, the game settles into a regular rhythm, swapping back and forth between Autobots and Decepticons with unique gameplay styles in each level. You've got a satisfying stealth section with Cliffjumper, but just when that threatens to outstay its welcome, you get an amazing series of vertical combat sequences with Jazz and his grappling hook. Then you've got one of the biggest environments yet as you pilot the Combaticons before transforming into the hulking Devastator, and so on and forth. The game's story only ramps up towards the end, but the variety of environments, characters, abilities, and traversal kept me hooked, always wanting to see what came next. Fall of Cybertron works in a massive scale, and while the gunplay is satisfying, when you zoom in on the details, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny quite as much. There are some new enemy designs, and old hassles like the shielded brutes have been done away with, but for the most part you're blasting your enemies to scrap over and over again. The weapon selection has seen a massive upgrade, but still, shoot, shoot, bang, bang, transform is the name of the game. The game's scale also requires concessions of the humble hardware it was forced onto. Slowdown, screen tearing, and frame drops are common throughout. They managed to keep Unreal Engine 3's infamous pop-up at bay mostly, but it still rears its ugly head. But seeing the efforts made and what Full Moon accomplished here remain nothing short of spectacular. Not only is this an improvement over the strengths of the first game, but it's a reinvention of everything that didn't work. At times, it's a rousing love letter to the Transformers universe, always handled with care even as it traverses some dark new territory. And as a fan of the series coming to this game for the first time, even over a decade after it first came out, Fall of Cybertron had no shortage of jaw-dropping and hair-raising moments in its grand story. It's a damn shame that Full Moon got relegated to the Call of Duty mine, similar to Singularity developer Raven Software. Everything they touched, even the tepid Deadpool game, showed such a love and care, and a unified creative spirit to deliver impressive moments that fans of the franchise had only dreamed of. While the Cybertron games were briefly ported to PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, they were delisted thereafter when Activision's deal with Hasbro expired, meaning the only way to play this game if you haven't bought it digitally before is physically. Truly a shame for such an obvious labor of love and an important reminder of High Moon's prowess. It's hard not to imagine what this team could have accomplished given the might of the PlayStation 4 era. For its few faults, technical shortcomings, some repetition in basic combat, and some gameplay sections towards the end that aren't as polished or can drag on a bit too long, Fall of Cybertron might not be an all-time classic. It's no Halo 3 or Call of Duty 4, but as a Transformers game, it may be the best shooter ever made to carry the series' name, and as just a shooter, it's one hell of a time that any player should be able to experience. Hey all, thank you very much for watching. So I'm back to doing some videos on video games, the thing that I started this channel for. Thank you all to everybody who watched and followed for my more political content. I am making more videos like that. I just have a couple other ones I want to get out of the way first. And then I will get back to more politically minded and in-depth video essays. In the meantime, if you could go to my Patreon, give a couple bucks, and get your name listed here as a producer, that would be ever so helpful. I'm kind of in between jobs at the moment. It's a long, sordid story, but I am working very hard all the time, and could always use the help. That having been said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.